This is a revision video for Specification 6 of the Social Influence Unit for A-Level Psychology. So we're looking at situational variables affecting obedience, including proximity, location and uniform. And just a very quick note to say, make sure that you focus in on obedience when you're talking about Milgram's variations. Don't be tempted to bring in the word conformity, because that will show that you've got the wrong form of social influence. So in the spec it says the situational variables, but you do need to know about Milgram's baseline experiment, like what actually happened, because we can use that for evaluation. So it's important that you know the procedure and the findings of that baseline experiment. However, if the question comes up that is just about situational variables, don't be tempted to give all of this detail unless it's asked for. So make sure that you know the very basic procedure, that it was a volunteer sample of 40 middle-aged American men, and it was a laboratory experiment at Yale University. The participants were deceived in two ways, well, in lots of ways, but certainly they were told the experiment was about how punishment affects learning, when actually it was on obedience to legitimate authority. Another element of deception was that they thought they had been randomly allocated to be the teacher in the experiment, but actually the learner and the experimenter were both confederates, which meant they were actors. So there were three people in the experiment: the learner, the teacher and the experimenter. And the teacher, so our participants, who they were told, they were instructed to give the learner an electric shock when they got a word pair wrong. That was the little task they were given. The shocks were actually fake. And so the teacher would start off by giving 15 volts of electric shock to the learner, the fake shock, and then that would increase by 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. And another part of the procedure was that the experimenter, who was another confederate, gave verbal prods to the teacher to continue. So they would say things like, you must continue with the experiment and it's required that you continue for the results. So if the teacher tried to withdraw, then the experimenter gave that verbal prod to continue. So that was the procedure. The findings, the most important finding in big letters there, or big numbers there, it says 65%. So the most important finding was that 65% of the original participants continued all the way to 450 volts, which, as we know, would be enough to kill you. Another finding was that 100% of participants went to 300 volts, and that was at that point, I think 5 people dropped out, but that was at the point that the learner, the confederate, started really shouting and complaining in the other room, and they'd be able to hear that. So if you're interested in doing some research methods practice, then you could pause the video and transform that information into an appropriate graph, but only if you want to practice your research methods. If you did, then this is what the graph should look like. It should be a bar chart and it should include a title, and the axes should be labelled. So the actual y-axis, which for some reason it wouldn't let me label it, should just be number of participants. And on the x-axis, we've got like the different levels of shock that people went to. So the main crux really of this part of the spec are the situational factors. And so the three, although Milgram did 18 variations, the three that are named in the spec are proximity, location and uniform. And so we'll look at each of those. The first one is proximity. Now this is a bit mean because there's actually 3 proximity variations that you need to know. And remember that every time we look at a variation, we are comparing that variation to the original 65% of people who obeyed in the first experiment. So proximity 1, if you look on the left-hand bit, it says learner and teacher in the same room. And so when they brought the learner into the same room as the teacher, then we saw obedience drop from 65% to 40%. And that was because they could see the pain that they were inflicting on the learner, even though it was fake and they were acting. Proximity 2, the teacher was asked to force the hand of the learner onto the shock plate when they refused. And in that instance, so you were reducing the proximity even more. In that instance, obedience dropped to 30%. And the third proximity variation was that the experimenter was put into a different room and gave instructions over the phone. And at that point, we saw quite a low obedience rate of 21%. And interestingly, the teachers were lying on the phone to the experimenter and saying things like, yep, I've given a shock, when really they hadn't. So when you increase the space between the person giving the instructions to the person receiving them, then there's less likely to be obedience, because they don't feel that same pressure and they can actually kind of get away with not actually obeying, because they can say they are obeying, but really they're not. The second variation is called location. So that picture there is Yale University, and that was the original location in the baseline experiment. So we know that obedience was 65%, but when they changed the location to a rundown office in Connecticut, then obedience dropped to 48%. So there's something about the prestigious location that acts as a factor that will affect obedience. When you, the institution you're in, the place that you are, if it carries prestige, then you are more likely to obey. The third variation was uniform. So in Milgram's original experiment, the experimenter wore a white lab coat, or it might have been a grey lab coat actually, and we know that the obedience was 65%. And in the variation, they got the experimenter was called away, and then one of the other supposed participants was asked to take on the role of the experimenter, and they were just wearing their ordinary clothes. Now I've put a white middle-class looking man in that picture because that was the original sample. So just one of the other people was asked to be the experimenter, and obedience dropped to 20%. So we can see the power of uniform in causing obedience. And it means that when a legitimate authority figure has got a kind of badge of authority, so that might be a lab coat, or it could be a police officer, you know, their police number and their uniform, a uniform carries a lot of weight when it comes to obedience. So those were the situational factors. If you're one of my students, then download handout SP02 from MS Teams or Moodle, and then you can, the handout there again explains all of the different variations and requests you to write a directional hypothesis for each and why the findings might have occurred. And that's just really good revision. If you're not one of my students, then you can download the handouts from the link in the description below. So the evaluation points, the first one is when it comes to evaluation, you are basically giving evidence for or against the original theory. So our original theory here is that it's about obedience to legitimate authority, and specifically looking at those factors of uniform, proximity and location. So this first evaluation point is a strength. It's evidence to support the power of uniform, and it was you could just briefly describe Bushman's study. You don't need to know his name or her name, Bushman, but it was where a research assistant dressed up as either a beggar, a police officer or a business exec, and it was the same person in different uniforms, and then they would approach somebody on the street and instruct them to give them 10 pence for an expired parking meter. And although that wasn't a lot of money, there was a direct instruction to give them money. So the results were that 72% obeyed the police officer, 48% the business exec and 52% the beggar. And so this is evidence to show the power of uniform in obedience. And this is good because this was a field experiment. If you think Milgram's experiment was a laboratory experiment, a really kind of fake place where people knew they were being experimented on, this was out in a natural setting, but the IV and DV was still manipulated, making it a field experiment. So it was looking at obedience in a much more natural environment. Another evaluation point you can go for is to really strongly criticise the ethics of Milgram's experiment, but be very specific. Don't just ramble on talking about the psychological harm that the participants would have experienced. If you do want to talk about psychological harm, have a look at the third point here. You can say how the knowledge that somebody might have that they could kill another person, even though they hadn't, that knowledge could have really damaged them. But also there's research to suggest that taking part in that research could have actually changed somebody's personality and made them more violent. It could have triggered them to become like more violent in their real life, and that change could have lasted forever. So there's a picture of a gun there with Darley, who is the experimenter in this case. Darley was the one who suggested that participation could trigger your personality to be kind of more violent. You could also, if you look at the top point, it talks about the deception. So you would need to identify all of the ways that the participants were deceived, because that breaks the BPS guidelines. People shouldn't be deceived because it leads to a lack of informed consent, and also they might be harmed by the deception. But make sure you identify the ways they were deceived. So they were told the experiment was about how punishment affects learning, when it was really about obedience to legitimate authority. You could say that they were deceived to believe they had been randomly allocated to be the teacher, but actually it wasn't random allocation. And the big deception really was that the shocks were fake, the shocks weren't real. So you could talk about that and say that all of those things led to a lack of informed consent. You could also criticise the study ethically, talking about the fact that participants wouldn't have known they had the right to withdraw from the experiment because of the verbal prods from the experimenter saying you must continue. So in research, everyone should have the right to withdraw, but they didn't feel that they had it. So if you write an evaluation point about ethics, don't make the whole of your evaluation about ethics, because you will only gain so many marks if you don't look at any other discussion points, and be really specific about the ethical issues within it. You can also criticise the whole experiment, the original baseline and all the variations, for a lack of realism. And these were some researchers called Orne and Holland who believed that the participants would not have believed that the shocks were real. And so at the time, one of Milgram's assistants called Murata actually divided the participants into doubters and believers. So they believed that some of the participants knew the shocks weren't real and some thought they were. And it was the believers who were more likely to disobey the experimenter and give low intensity shocks. And what this is saying, it's low internal validity because it wasn't well designed. If the shocks weren't, the participants didn't believe the shocks were real, then that was a problem, meaning that they were just displaying demand characteristics and doing what they thought they were meant to do. And when people thought the shocks were real, then they didn't shock the participant because they didn't want to cause them any harm. So use this evaluation point to criticise that low internal validity because people didn't believe that the shocks were real. You can also criticise the original research for gender bias. The research was beta biased because the original sample was 40 middle-aged men, and so we'll criticise the experiment for that. But Milgram then did further experiments on women and found identical rates of obedience, although the women felt more stress when they gave the shocks. And then there was a meta-analysis of 9 other studies worldwide that had male and female participants, and all of them, with one exception, also found no male-female differences. Quite an important, well, very important evaluation point here is that the research has been criticised for having low external validity. So Mandel in the 90s challenged the external validity of Milgram's research, and Mandel does not believe Milgram's research into obedience can explain real-life atrocities. So Mandel claims that Milgram's research simply offers an alibi for the obedience shown by the perpetrators of the Holocaust. So the reason that Milgram did the research was because his parents had fled the Holocaust, and he was really interested to see why is it that the Nazis would kill people in such horrific ways, and they're just the general people whose jobs it was to kind of do that. And that's why he did the research. But Mandel is criticising the research, saying you cannot excuse the behaviour of the people in the Holocaust by saying they were simply following orders. So we say low external validity because we can't really apply the results of Milgram's very controlled experiment in a laboratory to the real things that are going on in the world right now, and back when it was the Holocaust. So you might mention something called the Josephow massacre, and if you do, then you would need to give very, very brief details of that, in terms of it was Police Battalion 101 who marched Jewish prisoners of war a long way and then killed them face to face, and you can see in that picture there they were put in a mass grave. It was horrendous. So when we look at the details of that, we can criticise the variation of proximity, because according to Milgram, if you could see the pain you were inflicting, you were less likely to obey. But that wasn't the case with the Police Battalion 101 marching right next to the prisoners and killing them face to face. I've put there the Rebels study. Now, this wasn't in the 3 variations on the spec, but there is a variation where 2 other Confederates joined the original teacher and refused to shock the learner, and when they did that, obedience dropped to 10%. So it was saying that when you've got social support, when you've got an ally or someone on your side, then you can resist obedience much more easily. But in the Josephow massacre, there were rebels. There were people who said, well, I'm not doing it, and so according to Milgram, that should have persuaded other people not to do it, but they did. And the third part was about uniform. Like, the commanding officer would have had a uniform that was more commanding, and the commanding officer actually said to them, you don't have to do this task. However, people still chose to do it. So we can use those to show how Milgram's research couldn't really apply to real life. Okay, so there's one more evaluation which you might or might not want, and it's to criticise Milgram's original experiment that it had low ecological validity and a biased sample. So it was in a laboratory experiment which was very fake environment, and it only had male participants. So once you've criticised that element, you could then go on to say, however, there was research in the 60s by Hoffling, and that Hoffling did a field experiment. So this was a natural environment where the IV and DV were both manipulated. And in that experiment, 22 nurses were phoned up by a supposed doctor who was a Confederate and told to give medication to a patient, even though the instructions were to give too much medication. And also the nurses knew they weren't supposed to take orders over the phone, but the doctor would have been a much higher authority figure. And so actually 21 out of the 22 nurses obeyed the doctor, which showed there is really high obedience sometimes in real life environments. And in this situation, it was on 22 women. So I would recommend, we know this is coming up in the exam, I would recommend that you pause the video and answer these short answer questions. And then, so this is an AO2 exam style question. AO2 means apply your knowledge, and this is from a specimen past paper. And so it means that you should read the stimulus that is on the screen, and then the question says, referring to research into obedience, explain 3 reasons why the instructor's advice should be effective, for 6 marks. If it's 6 marks, that's really broken down into 3 paragraphs, like 2 marks per paragraph. So you're looking for the 3 reasons, the 3 variables affecting obedience. So you should be looking for something to do with proximity, location and uniform in the stimulus. So a model answer for that is available. I'll put a link in the description where you can download that. But have a go at that question and think you need to find, you have to quote the bit in the stimulus that shows location and then say why it will be effective. So which, so basically at that point you're referring to the Yale rundown off its part of Milgram's research. So we know that this is definitely coming up in the exam, variables affecting obedience, but we don't know whether it's going to be a full essay, extended essay question. If you've got time, if it was me, I would prepare a 16 marker just in case. And so on the screen is a structure that you could follow in order to achieve that 16 marks. When it comes to the evaluation, you should choose between 3 and 5 evaluation points or discussion points. And it's kind of, if you go for 3, you've got to do it in a lot of detail. If you do 5 evaluation points, less detail. But for each evaluation, you should certainly start a new paragraph, and I've put there, don't just put / like in the middle of your writing, because you want to make life easy on the examiners. The easier it is to read, the easier it is for them to allocate the marks. So start a new paragraph for each evaluation, identify whether that discussion point is a strength or a limitation of the research, and make sure that the paragraph really assesses the original research and it kind of scrutinises it. So I'm going to give you an example of an evaluation paragraph on the next slide. So, for example, you might choose to do the evaluation about the gender bias. So you would put a criticism of Milgram's original research is that it was gender biased using only a sample of 40 men. This lacks population validity and suggests the findings cannot be generalised to women. However, Milgram found in subsequent research that women had identical rates of obedience but experienced more stress giving the shocks. 9 other replications of the obedience experiments worldwide, which had male and female participants, also found no male-female differences, but with one exception. So you can use that evaluation paragraph, but make sure that you write your own as well. Don't just rely on thinking, oh yeah, I'll remember that thing about the Joseph Al massacre, I'll write about that. If you don't write the evaluation paragraph, then it's going to be extremely hard in the exam to remember like what the details that need to go into it. If you write an evaluation paragraph and then edit it and make it really like as few words as possible with as much detail, that's really elaborate kind of rehearsal, elaborate thinking, and that will really help it go into your long-term memory. So I would write the 16 marker and then practice doing it in about 20 minutes to see if you can do it, because really that's how long you would get in the exam to write an extended essay writing question. And some of the exam papers have got 3 16 markers on them, which is 50% of the paper, so it's really worth practicing those skills. I'll put a model essay, in a link to a model essay for this in the description below.